It should work now.
Beautiful. Very nice. Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to talk to you about my research today. So I've noticed throughout presentations, there's been a sort of lurking question about, well, what can we do? You know, how do we address this at these problems at a broader structural level? And I'm going to try to wade into that. I don't have great answers. A lot of what I come up with is going to be kind of messy, but I want to take a stab at it anyway. So back in 2011, Iris Marion Young releases Responsibility for Justice. In this book and a number of articles she had released, she develops the concept of a structural injustice. She's trying to really refocus our attention from individual wrongs to wrongs done at the social or structural level. Now, because the wrongs are genuinely structural, Young contends that blame is not appropriate for individual participants in a structural injustice. Instead, she wants to propose a more aspirational, forward-looking theory of social obligations instead. In this presentation, I would actually like to argue, given the somewhat non-ideal political situation we find ourselves in, that blame very much does have a role in political transformation. Let's begin with a structural injustice. I know it's been addressed in a number of presentations. I'll give you Young's basic definition. So traditionally, an injustice or a wrong is taken usually to be one individual harming another, or maybe one harming many. This leaves open the possibility of also a situation where many are harming many, and this kind of gets at what Iris Marion Young means by structural injustice, which occurs roughly when a system, social structures, material conditions, customs, norms, habits all function such that some people cannot fulfill their basic human rights and improve their basic condition. So we have a situation where you have people interacting through institutions against the backdrop of a number of social expectations, constrained by material conditions, and really they're participating in these in good faith. They're trying their best to improve their lives, but nonetheless, the entire functioning of the system itself is holding some people in a state of deprivation. In her favored example that she explains in Responsibility for Justice, Young paints a picture of a young woman named Sandy who has a couple children. She lives in a relatively expensive city, a place like San Francisco, maybe. She works in service work. It doesn't pay very well, and husband or dad is out of the picture. So one day, Sandy's landlord comes to her and tells her that he's going to renovate her apartment and that she has to move out. So she begins to look, but everywhere she goes, she sees that every single apartment requires 3 months, right? First, last, security deposit, and she doesn't have that. The reality is most Americans cannot come up with, you know, $1,500, $3,000 to move into a new apartment. So she looks and she looks, and move out day comes and there is no apartment. So she's forced to move into her car with her children and be homeless for 2 to 3 months. Now, Young contends that in this example, the way she structured this, no one is personally responsible because everyone was just trying to do the best they could, given the constraints that they're in. Landlord is just trying to make the apartment better, right? Real estate agent is just trying to find her help a place, is trying to help her to find a place. Nonetheless, she says this is not a tragedy. This is an injustice. This is a wrong, and the reason is because the system is, in a sense, doing it to her, and it is reliably doing it to her and many other people in her social position. Now, because no one is sort of personally responsible for this, she says that blame and fault are inappropriate reactions to a structural injustice. Instead, she says we should be looking at what she calls a social connection theory of responsibility. And a social connection theory attempts to bind us all together with forward-looking shared obligation to transform the offending social structures through political action, through advocacy and direct action and protest and so on, possibly even voting. Now, in another work back in 2019, I challenged some of her theoretical arguments. My basic contention is that if you really drill down at our contemporary structural injustices, you will find that there is plenty of blame to go around for bad actors in our social structures as we find them today. But Young could come back and say, okay, even if it is appropriate to blame some of the participants, say the landlord, right, for wanting to upgrade his apartments, nevertheless, there could be pragmatic reasons to withhold blame, right? So even if someone is responsible, maybe overall, because of the unintended consequences of blaming participants in a structural injustice, we just shouldn't do it. And this is really the aim of my presentation today. I'm going to argue that the unintended consequences of blaming participants in structural injustice are perhaps not quite as bad as she thinks. And second, I'm going to argue that there could actually be a good or productive consequence to this. So what are the unintended consequences of blaming it? And really, this is in the context of blaming people in these large sort of dispersed collective injustice or social injustices, right? So blaming the landlord, blaming NIMBYs for, voting down 5/1 apartments or something like that. So to begin with, Young contends that blame is too focused on the past. So the very nature of a structural injustice is such that it is really continuing on into the future to hold people in a state of deprivation. The problem is really future oriented, and it doesn't do a whole lot of good to be like, hey, you landlord, look what you did, right? You renovated your apartment. She's like, because if any other landlord did that, this is just going to happen again to someone like Sandy and her because of her social position. Instead, we should be focused on the future. And that's why she suggests a forward-looking theory of obligations, right? That only about positive obligations, not any kind of negative criticism or blame. Blame stirs up reactive sentiments, right? If you were to go to the landlord and say, hey, you buddy, this is all your fault, landlord would probably say, it's not my fault, right? I'm trying to make the apartments better. People keep complaining about these apartments. I'm just trying to fix them up. And her worry there is that if you are stirring up reactive sentiments, you are not doing the work to create a broad coalition that can collectively transform the structure into something better. Young contends that blame divides and separates. And one of the things that blame does is sort of pushes someone outside of the group and says, you are no longer one of us, right? You need to repent of what you've done, possibly atone for it, use more religious language, but until you've done so, you're an outsider. And she's, once again, this is not conducive to coalition politics. And finally, she thinks blame could lead to self-indulgence. So once the reactive sentiments, the negative anger and things like that subside, there might be a kind of self-indulgent like, oh, woe is me. I can't believe how awful I was. Everything is my fault, right? Sandy's homelessness is my fault. Systemic racism is my fault. I'm paralyzed and so on. And she's like, this is just not conducive to aspirational organizing. We want people energized and excited to bring about a better society, not kind of wallowing in a sort of narcissistic self-guilt. Now, here's the thing. These are bad, perhaps. I just don't think they're necessarily so bad. So let me take them one at a time. Is blame too focused on the past? I mean, yeah, blame does focus on past actions sometimes, but it has a forward-looking element as well. The more unpleasant forward-looking element, which Martha Nussbaum notes in her preface to Responsibility for Justice, is that it deters, right? When you get blamed, you may not want to do that bad thing in the future anymore. It also signals to others in this social setting, you do not do that. And then maybe, out of fear of ostracization, they'll withhold it. Now, obviously, that's an unpleasant way to do ethics, but it could also be the case, and I'm going to argue, we'll explain this a little later, that blame can be part of a system of renorming certain social spaces such that norms that encourage better actions become operative. And in this case, it won't even be out of fear. There'll just be a general social expectation that you behave differently. And that could be a good thing, as I'll argue. Does it stir up reactive sentiments? I mean, sure, but I think sometimes worrying too much about the fact that someone's going to get angry when you call them out can also paralyze you from perhaps bringing important things to light. And you just sort of have to deal with the fact that people are going to be upset, but that anger could go away. Now, the force of this objection is perhaps reasonable if we think about blaming large portions of people that are supposed to be in your movement, right? If you're like, well, an entire country or religion or gender or race is to blame altogether. Well, yeah, I mean, there's some pragmatic worries there, but generally speaking, my solution here would be like, you can focus your blame at the smaller, more powerful groups who actually do have the ability to facilitate structural transformation, maybe not on their own, but at least to grease the wheels a little bit. And that'll at least mitigate some of the worries about, leaving too many people out of your political movement. Does blame divide and separate? I mean, sure it does, but sometimes you got to call people out, right? One of the ways that people try to maintain the status quo is that they try to kind of like blend in with other people. Be like, hey, I'm just like you. I'm like everyone else. And you got to call them out and be like, no, you're not just like everyone else. You had the chance to do something and repeatedly you have not done it. I mean, it's especially true with politicians, for instance, who like to absolve themselves of responsibility for not doing much. So I think dividing and separating is necessary, even when you're trying to build a broad coalition. And does it lead to self-indulgence? I mean, yeah, there's been a little bit of the, public narcissism, especially stuff like white guilt. I view that stuff as like, okay, it seems kind of mean, but like so much theater, I don't think it's actually that important either way. I'm not sure it's going to, that itself is going to contribute to structural transformation like the public displays, nor do I think it's really going to create that big a backlash. I think that people who really want to work to genuinely change the material conditions and social structures can kind of ignore that stuff. And eventually go away. And, people, if they really are in favor of the structural transformation, if it's not just theater, right, then they will be along with your coalition anyway. So I just don't think any of these consequences are all that bad. And I want to now move on to suggest that there is one possible consequence, which you've already touched upon, which could be worth it, actually kind of liberally employing blame in certain situations. But in order to get there, I do need to justify myself in that it's going to seem kind of unpleasant what I'm recommending, but I'm saying it's only necessary because of our relatively dire political situation in this country. So I have to give Iris Marion Young credit. I think she is in most respects a non-ideal theorist. She is willing to take our world as we find it. She makes no assumption that the social structures of our country or any other country are even minimally just. In fact, I think she assumes that there are many structural injustices around the globe. However, in her more positive theory of social obligations, I do think Young shades towards the ideal, right? In her mind, what she wants is a broad coalition politics where everyone is kind of on the same level. There's mutual recognition, right? In her book, she says the oppressor and the oppressed can both be part of this coalition together and we can all kind of transform it together. And that sounds great. And I wish that that were true. But I'm going to just quickly rattle off some reasons why that kind of politics is really challenging in our country. First of all, Republicans are increasingly overrepresented in the House, Senate, and Electoral College. Some of this has to do with the recent political alignment Used to be Republicans were the ones with more college degrees. Now they're the ones with fewer college degrees. Some stuff about rural and urban and so on. But the point is, you can win the presidency as Republican with millions fewer votes, and it's gonna be really hard for Democrats to hold the House in the future. Hold the Senate in the future because the way this country is structured. Congressional districts are drawn in ways to consolidate power for whatever political party holds the state legislature, right? So if you hold the state legislature and it's a districting year, you can just kind of give yourself more power. Despite having a high number of registered voters, voter turnout is comparatively low in American elections. Many political candidates run unopposed. We don't have a holiday for voting. Working class people tend not to vote. Very poor people definitely do not vote in very large numbers. So that's deeply troubling. They're not having their voice heard in any meaningful way. And the issue of people running opposed, some of the most important statewide offices go to people with very few democratic checks on them. State prosecutor, for instance, prosecutors elected. Prosecutor has massive amount of discretion over how the criminal justice system works, and would argue the most discretion of any person in the system. And yet most prosecutors run unopposed in this country. Income and social status are delegated by a narrow range of elite American universities, which are mostly closed off to people from poorer neighborhoods. Do some people achieve upward social mobility? Yeah, but it's getting worse, is my sense. Most of the justices in the Supreme Court come from only 2 elite law schools. Supreme Court is increasingly a super legislature that has to make decisions on everything from social to economic policy for us. Much of their reasoning is guided by things like intuitions and what they consider to be reasonable. And this is just not a body that it is at all representative of the American Republic. Politicians increasingly hold divergent views from the base of their parties, and this has been getting worse in recent years. Both conservatives and liberals, so both Democrats and Republicans, the party elites tend to just have very different positions. And part of this, you can see the fracture in things like Donald Trump versus someone like Mitch McConnell. The modal Republican voter is probably closer to Donald Trump, and yet the individuals like Mitch McConnell tend to dominate much of Republican politics. And finally, there is massive inequality, and it is segregated by race in this country. So a number of Black Americans live in a condition the sociologist Douglas Massey calls hyper-segregation. You want to kind of know how this works. Robert Sampson has an excellent book on the sociological conditions of Chicago, came out in 2012. And he found that in some neighborhoods, that there were Black neighborhoods where the median wealth was to the left of the entire white distribution. So the median wealth was the sort of median Black individual in a majority Black neighborhood was poorer than the poorest white person, right? And if you're interested, Massey's got an excellent book on segregation. The ways in which segregation is reproduced are awfully ingrained. So my conclusion here is it's not an ideal political environment. We do have a number of very powerful elites. We have a pretty massive upper middle class here, and a lot of them are completely cut off from what most of the country is going through. And just to give you some examples to make this more intuitive, the opioid crisis continues to kill. I think last year in 2020, it killed possibly close to 100,000 people. That would be like a nuclear weapon going off in Cedar Rapids, right? Every year. And yet it never seems to trickle its way up into popular media concerns, or it does only in these kinds of heart of darkness, traveling into Appalachia or whatever like that. But for the most part, it's quickly forgotten. I mean, yet it's kind of tearing through the area around here. And I'll talk a little bit about, there's a workers' movement going around right now that's getting very little press too. So anyway, given this condition, there are serious constraints on these kinds of egalitarian social movements where everyone has mutual recognition. And my argument is not to give up those movements. I think they're tremendously valuable, but you need to supplement them with whatever kinds of tools you have, right? Within the bounds of morality, of course. And I think that public acts of blaming can be used to influence elite behavior and habits of mind by everyday not elite people, and collectively it can eventually renorm elite spaces. And when I mean say elite, I mean a functional definition only. I mean people who legitimately have power, who could quickly get power, who have influence and things like that. Someone with a PhD working at Starbucks is not going to be considered elite in this case. I mean politicians, business leaders, some doctors and lawyers and stuff like that too. So to make this intuitive now, I'm going to conclude with an example where I think this did happen. And a lot of this is probably spurred on by the global financial crash of 2008. Still think we are dealing with the ramifications of that. But I want to talk about the Black Lives Matter and post-2014 protests and why they really seem to reflect a slightly different spirit than some of the perhaps earlier ones. So in June 2014, set the stage for this with Ta-Nehisi Coates publishes a case for reparations in the Atlantic. One of his primary aims is to get John Conyers' bill, H.R. 40, a fair look in the House. And Conyers' bill really was only to examine the possibility of reparations. It wasn't even for reparations itself, and it was not able to make it to the floor. Oh, and before I go on, let me say his article is not in any way, that Jim Crow or slavery or anything was a tragedy. I mean, it was very accusatory. It wasn't just that like, oh, we haven't put the structures in place yet for Black people to achieve better wealth. It was that Black wealth has been plundered by white elites. Right? In August 2014, not long thereafter, Michael Brown is killed in Ferguson, right, shot by a police officer. This kicks off Black Lives Matter protests. Black Lives Matter had been around since 2013, but you really start to see the movement gain more prominence at this time. And once again, there are now accusations of blame, largely of having failed large parts of the African-American community, right? So politicians had failed Black people. College presidents had failed, business leaders had failed, right? Failed to do something about racism, failed to actually create a more just system. Of course, recently, protests come back. They become even wider spread in 2020 with George Floyd. And the attitude, too, is one of accusation and blame. But the thing is, by 2020, I think you have already seen a sort of renorming of educated and elite spaces. Now, there was always a strong social justice movement going through like the academy, but I think this is now spread much more broadly. And the final thing that you may be like, well, okay, the discourse has changed, but does the discourse really matter? And I want to say, yeah, actually, as far as the discourse of elites, it does matter because certain options which were closed off become possible, and certain options which seemed obvious, like seemed inevitable that you would do, suddenly become out of bounds. So the first, and I think the weakest, was a number of corporate promises were made to earmark money for, say, African-American scholarships, but also to try to aggressively hire more African-Americans or just hire more minorities quite broadly. But more importantly, in both the CARES Act and the America Rescue Act, you saw genuine color-conscious funding, right? Money to universities, historically Black colleges and universities actually got extra money, right? In the America Rescue Act, you saw money earmarked for Black farmers. And this is highly unusual. I mean, to go back and think, even Bill Clinton, the liberal, right, would never, ever have thought about doing something like this. So it's quite remarkable. And then Conyers' H.R. 40 was actually reintroduced, and I think it was heading, when I was writing this, and it was heading for a sort of historic markup. So are these kind of modest? Yeah, right. And I know people are always like, we don't need modest changes, we need large changes. But the reality is, like I've said, we're working in a very non-ideal political situation. You have to kind of take what you can get. Now, has there been backlash? Yes. There have been books by, say, Christopher Caldwell and Doug Murray, I think I'm getting the wrong way, Murray, about basically criticizing the Civil Rights Act. I'm not convinced it's that bad. Murray's book basically flopped. It was nothing compared to the bell curve, right? It's much more popular. He's greatly been kind of marginalized from elite spaces. Okay, there is an anti-critical race theory movement going on. I understand. And this could be seen as a backlash. But once again, I think sometimes it's the like actual prevalence of this is maybe a little bit overblown. And some of it too is connected to like anti-vax movements and just general more conservative anxiety about not having control over school boards and things like that. Yeah, there's some free speech bills, but nonetheless, like this was to be expected, right? You can't challenge the status quo without having some pushback. Right? And I mean, the most serious thing is that there are lawsuits, open civil rights lawsuits against color conscious funding, right? Generally, 14th Amendment has been used in the last 50 years to challenge any kind of color conscious policy. But given that, right, the only reason these things exist is because there is now an attempt to do this, right? And I'm just not sure that taking some resistance as being like, oh, well, there's resistance, we have to give up now. I think you try to meet that resistance. You hold firm to your principles and you keep trying to push for more. Now, let me just say two encouraging things. Maybe you won't find them encouraging, I do. First of all, even some conservatives now support reparations. So Ross Douthat and David Brooks, if you can call him a conservative anymore, both have written in favor of reparations. That's a huge drastic change from the 90s. Scott Winship, who is currently a fellow for AEI, right? AEI, the extremely conservative think tank, just put out a study on poverty that said that basically poverty cannot properly be addressed in the United States without race-conscious economic efforts. And that's astounding to have AEI say something like that. So that is evidence of a norm shift, I think, in educated spaces. And then finally, there is a diversity push in elite institutions to try to diversify the people who hold positions of power. Now, I'm not a true believer in trickle-down diversity, but I'm just going to argue that in our non-ideal political situation, yes, I mean, you do seem to need some buy-in from elites. And my one final example is very recently, there's been a workers' movement, as I had sort of highlighted, and I think it's been a kind of combination of grassroots organizing, but a lot of that grassroots organizing, right, people quitting their jobs, people striking, has been facilitated by Jay Powell targeting full employment with monetary policy, right? And he has been doing this since 2017 or so, and also the unemployment insurance. So both fiscal and monetary policy primarily passed by elites in combined with the workers' movement. And I mean, I think you're actually seeing some good things now. So in conclusion, I'm going to say, yes, absolutely, organize, go for the egalitarian movement, but also understand our very challenging political reality. And that's why I think blame should be part of the toolbox. It doesn't have to be done out of hatred, but some good accusations targeted at the right people could help to renorm the environment such that your political goals suddenly become more possible. So thank you so much for coming to my presentation. And I'm excited to hear your questions and comments.
David, thank you so much for that talk. So it looks like we already have some hands in queue. I will let you moderate yourself from both the chat and from those who have their hands raised.
Jen Kling.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. That was awesome. So I have, I think, two questions, but I will try to combine them because I think that they're related. So I'm wondering here how much of your point is pragmatic and how much of it is based on like what you think is like appropriate to the nature of the problems, right? Because part of Jung's point, I take it, is that in many cases, like blame just isn't appropriate because that's not how structural injustice works, right?
Right.
But she also says that like she develops her model of responsibility as like a supplement to liability, right? Models of responsibility, right? Because she's like,
Sure.
If you can follow the chain of evidence, yeah, like blame them by all means, right? Like hold them liable. She just thinks like a lot of times we can't follow chains of evidence, right? So and so then I think like, then this leads to a question for your account, right? Are you saying like blame because blame is appropriate in some cases, in which case it's not clear to me that Jung would disagree with you? or are you saying like, hey, blame because like it just turns out like blame works, right? Like
Yeah.
Jung got the like psychology wrong. Do you know what I mean? And so I'm just
Yeah.
wondering like which direction you're wanting to go here.
Kind of both. And so the dialectics,
Okay.
the dialectical back and forth is that, and other people have made this point too. I'm going to butcher her name here, but Maeve McCone or McKeon has made a similar point that the reality is most structural injustices as we find them are just not pure in the sense that Jung might mean, and the fact that they have been heavily facilitated by the bad actions of people that can be identified. Now, I think what Iris Marion wants to do and is have a sort of a blame picture that works along kind of more legalistic lines, right? So if you have transgressed a public official norm, like that's where blame is appropriate. Because like some of her pictures of where blame isn't appropriate to me seems like completely outrageous stuff, right? Like Sandy, you know, I would go look at the entire way that San Francisco is structured and be like, that's outrageous, right? I mean, there's no high rises there. Who's been stopping these high rises from being built, right? All these tech people who are like lobbying for, I mean, you know, as far as like, why is Sandy going homeless? I'd be like, you could point so many fingers, even in the example that she gives it. So that's a theoretical point. But now it could be, right, that there's still some really bad consequences. Indeed, are there bad consequences to like blaming groups of people? I mean, yeah, you can come up with one after the other in history where, especially against powerless groups, right? You know, certain people, for instance, a blame of like Jewish people being a secret cabal, et cetera, stuff like that. And that's really dangerous. And I can't deny that, right? So my attempt to sort of feed back in blame, as I've already tried to argue that it's sort of technically correct, even when it's really dispersed, but that also it can't necessarily be defeated by worries about unintended consequences. And that's why I'm just trying to use one example, the Black Lives Matter protest, where things like anger and blame seem to have some effect. So I know I'm trying to have it both here, but my thought was to be a kind of dialectic. And I'll just conclude with, I think one of the biggest differences perhaps between me and Iris Marion Jung isn't necessarily, how to put this, like intellectual so much as she passed away in 2006, 2007. She was not able to see the financial crash, and the financial crash like completely just, I think anyway, I would argue, just completely changed the way we think about politics in this country. You know, we're talking about Bushes and Clintons as presidents, and suddenly you have like pretty angry candidates. You know, Bernie with a pretty populist left populist position. You have kind of bomb thrower Trump, you know, picking up the Buchanan and winning, right? And so like everything's been kind of different since then. And I feel like the difference between me and her is I'm working in a new cultural material environment, perhaps, which is why I think maybe that's the reason I've come to different conclusions, primarily. Thought Rachel had a hand up.
Yeah, I think my question may have been answered in the response to the last question, but I was just going to ask for a clarification about who the object of the who is being blamed in the landlord case and for what they're being blamed.
Yeah, so Jung would say no one is to blame because everyone is acting within the boundaries of generally accepted conduct. And in some ways, okay, so one ways I'm really cheating this is Jung is being very careful not to, careful to take more of a maybe critical theoretic stance and not to impose a kind of universalist morality in this, except that there's, you know, there are certain internal norms of conduct within certain societies. Okay, sorry. I will address it next. So Jung does say she's careful not to impose a kind of universalist morality, whereas I kind of am presupposing something like that. And maybe that's all, it's certainly unfair to her. But then she does kind of get this distinction between accepted norms of conduct being, in some sense, where you can apply blame. So blame is kind of appropriate situations where like you knew in advance that the behavior was wrong. But there are certain situations like, and let me use another example of structural injustice where I think blame is perfectly fine, where everyone's acting against, accepted norms of modern liberal morality, whatever. And that would be Nike. Like Nike, the claims, Nike, one of the most aggressive offshores, also one of the most exploitative corporations, ruthless. And when they're claiming, it's just like, hey, we're a business. We're just trying to compete with other businesses. We're going to get, overwhelmed by Puma. And I guess according to like generally accepted norms of conduct in the 70s and 80s, when we have this sort of rise of neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, that's perfectly fine. That's encouraged. It's going to, it's going to destroy the high inflation and raise all boats or whatever. I don't know. But I would argue that like the CEO of Nike's, their behavior still showed like really, really incredible greed. He was making plenty of money when he started offshoring. His goal was to tap into new Asian markets and make like uncontrollable profits. And you'd be like, okay, maybe that was generally accepted. And I'm still going to stand like, from my standpoint, there are numerous even internal traditions that we could point to where that kind of greed is extremely bad. So sorry, it's a long point, but I think you're touching on something important here. Young is just very cautious not to impose the kind of moral framework I am, whereas I've been a little more liberal with that. And for that reason, I can blame the landlord, right? I can say like, you're being greedy or whatever. Whereas she might want to be like, no, I mean, there's a certain expectations we have for landlords, and this landlord was acting within that expectation. And same thing with voters, right? Like everyone votes down tall buildings in their neighborhood. And I might want to say like, if you're living in San Francisco, you need to be voting for tall buildings. I'm sorry, you need to overturn that law. That's the only way people are going to be afford to live there. I mean, you have massive homelessness population. People need housing, right? And yet people are like, but my aesthetics, right? I mean, and there's a racial angle too, right? They're like high rises for Black people, and I don't want those in my community. That's blameworthy, I would argue too. So yeah, I'm happy to keep this like at least minimally universalistic ethic where there's certain basic human rights or something that we should respect. Okay, I saw,
Thank you.
yes, Young says we're all criticizable. She wants to keep the like entire more legalistic side of blame, I think isolated to more legalistic situations where we're, there's a rule that you intentionally violated or like very violently, negligently violated, and then we blame you. Whereas maybe this is just post 2008 me being like, no, we need to get on people much more about things like how they vote on high rises and, reproducing segregation, for instance. Go on my segregation rant if you want, but like the reality is, what is it? I don't know what the numbers are, but basically once you get over like 10% Black, most white people, and this includes white, rich progressives, are like, no way. I do not want more than like 10% Black people in my neighborhood, even though reverse is not true. African-Americans tend to say, I want a genuinely diverse neighborhood. So that's, I think, even if it's generally been accepted, I think that should be called that too.
All right. And on that note, technically the session did end about 5 minutes ago.
Okay.
Which is fine. We have some good discussion going. But I want to thank David and I want to thank Amy both for the presentations. And I think we'll reconvene here in about 4 minutes at 3:25 Central Time for session 5. Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone, for coming.